Hi, my name is Ethan, and welcome to another edition of Smoke Signals. Today I'm going to be ranking my top 20 favorite debut albums in rock history. Um, Obviously, going from 20 to 1, and then I'll have some honorable mentions as well. Um, since the last video that I made, I've been um, attended to quite a few shows since it has been some time since I've uploaded any new videos. Um, Going all the way back to the beginning of the year, um, I got to see this band, which is not typically my thing, um, but I got to see a friend of mine. My friend Ryan asked me to go see Humphreys McGee. That was at the Thomas Wolfe or U.S. Harrah's, I think it's called now, in downtown Asheville. That was back in February, and so not typically my thing. Humphreys McGee are a jam band, what's typically known as jam band music. This subgenre of music I'm just not usually that into. I do love the Grateful Dead. It's one of my all-time favorite bands. Um, However, other bands in that genre like Moe and the String Cheese Incident, Fish, Widespread Panic, I'm just not a fan of any of those bands. But this band was pretty amazing. Really talented technical musicians. And they did one of the highlights for me. The light show was amazing. Not surprising with the jam band. And they did do a interesting. It was like a mashup of "Closer" by Nine Inch Nails and "Come Together" by the Beatles, which I thought was an interesting combination. But beyond that, yeah, not typically my thing. Um, let's see. And then in June, I saw the mighty Ty Segall for the second time. I'd seen him back. I forget the name of that band. He's had so many side projects and so many albums. I saw him back in probably like I want to say 6 years ago or so, 5 6 years ago, at the Orange Peel. He was at the Orange Peel again in Asheville, and he the first time I saw him, he performed dressed like a baby, and he had like a baby doll on stage and umbilical cord. It was very strange. He was pointing at the audience, and one of the more bizarre shows I've ever seen. And it was also really, really good musically. Um, this show was also awesome. It started a little slow. He started out with a couple of acoustic numbers with the other guitar player, I believe, and maybe like 3 or 4 songs, and it was kind of anticlimactic a little bit, getting the show started off that way. But once he went into the electric full band, it was really awesome. So that was back in June. In July, I saw Tedeschi Trucks Band with Los Lobos um, at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, my hometown. This is the third time I've seen Tedeschi Trucks, and the previous 2 times I saw them back in 2019 and 2020, and it was both at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee. This third performance was a little lackluster. They seemed a little slower, a little quieter. There just wasn't a lot of the upbeat soul music that they typically do. But it was a good show nonetheless. Being in the Fox Theater is always awesome. I felt like the sound, obviously the sound is a lot better in the Ryman than even the Fox Theater, even though the Fox is a very old theater as well. But nevertheless, um, it was a good show. Saw Weed Eater again for the second time. I've seen them in July in a place called the Speakeasy, very small dive bar club that typically has a lot of punk and metal shows over in Johnson City, Tennessee, which is just about 40 minutes from where I live in North Carolina. And they never fail to disappoint. I think they were even better this time. Had a couple opening acts. I can't recall the names of the bands, but it was a wall to wall. It was we got to the door, and I didn't pre-order tickets, so I wasn't sure we were going to get in because it was at capacity. But we were able to get in, and it was Weed Eater, one of my favorite bands. They just never fail to deliver. Power trio, stoner metal, sludge metal, whatever you want to call them, from Wilmington, North Carolina. And a little bit later in September, Finally got to see the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'd never seen them. This was in Charlotte at the big stadium there where the Panthers play, along with the Strokes, who I've also never seen, who were awesome live, and Thundercat, virtuoso bass player who's only been out a couple years. Put out a couple albums, but he does sort of this. He has a kind of a. They get a drummer and an organ player, synth player, and himself. It's just a trio, and it's very proggy, very jazzy. Um, and somehow, although all three of these bands were completely different, it somehow it worked. Thundercat played; it was still daylight outside, and then the Strokes came on board and did their performance. It was awesome. Always wanted to see those guys. And also in September, also at the Orange Peel in Asheville, I got to see the Mighty Testament. Second time I've seen Testament. Saw them once back in 2018 at a metal festival in Charlotte, along with Slayer, Anthrax, Lamb of God, and a few other bands. Testament, Exodus, and Death Angel. Death Angel started the show. The sound level for Death Angel was a little bit quiet, but they were awesome. Legendary band. Love one of the original thrash bands from the mid to late 80s. And Exodus played second, and then Testament closed it out with the mighty Dave Lombardo, formerly of Slayer, on drums, which was one of the main reasons I was going, was to see Dave Lombardo play. I think out of the three bands, Exodus were the highlight. They just really had it together, and all of these guys, are like in their 50s or 60s at this point, and they just, they were headbanging, they were playing, they were soloing. It was, all three bands were just amazing, but especially Exodus and Testament. And Testament were way better this time than the time I saw them a few years ago. That same week at the Orange Peel, I saw the Mountain Goats, which are more of an indie rock thing. Not really my thing as much. I kind of went with my girlfriend, and she's really into that band. And but they do put on a really good show. I'm not into the music so much, but the showmanship of that band is really impressive. A lot of different instruments, piano, different segments to the show. So I was really impressed by that. Saw Driving and Crying, Georgia legendary band from my home state, at the Great Eagle, also in September. That was here in Asheville. Oh gosh, how many times have I seen these guys? In one form or another, I've seen Kevin Kinney or Driving and Crying probably 6, 7, 8 times at least, if not more. I've lost count at this point. But also saw Kevin Kinney solo down in Macon last fall, which I don't think that I talked about on the channel. He played at Capricorn Records. I got to tour Capricorn Records back in November of last year. And let's see, October of this year, Sunny Day Real Estate, the legendary indie rock pioneers. Most people probably associate, that are outside of like underground music from the 90s, associate them with the Foo Fighters, because two of the members were in the original lineup of the Foo Fighters touring band. A phenomenal show, just unbelievably good. They were just, it was like they never left, and really was impressed by them. Kind of a more spacey, whimsical indie rock than some indie rock that can tend to be choppy and guitar based. There was a lot of effects, a lot of feedback in their performance. And let's see, in October also I saw the mighty King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard for the second time. First time I saw them was back in 2019. Australian band, really hard to define, probably the most original and hardworking rock band of today. Very prolific. I think they put out 5 albums in 2022 alone, and I think they put out their best album in 2022, which was Omnium Gatherum. Just a phenomenal performance. They played outside at the Rabbit Rabbit in Asheville in October. And let's see. Always wanted to see these guys. Also in October at the Great Eagle in Asheville, I saw Mac Sabbath, which is, if you don't know by now, a Black Sabbath cover band dressed as Ronald McDonald characters, and they do a pretty good job. It's very theatrical, lots of props. Um, and opening for them was a band from LA that I had heard about, but I never knew much about their music. They were originally called REO Speed Dealer, but for obvious reasons, legal reasons, they had to change their name, and now they're just called Speed Dealer. And they were phenomenal. It was kind of like hard hardcore punk meets metal, and the lead singer and the lead guitarist were just incredible to watch. Highly recommend you check them out. Speed Dealer, if you ever get the chance. And then I saw Ty Segall again. This time at the Great Eagle, he did a acoustic show, and I have to say that this was a little bit lacking, to say the least. It was a packed house because it's Ty Segall and it's the Great Eagle, which is a smaller venue than Orange Peel. And I just felt like on acoustic, I'm not so sure that it works with Ty. He's one of my favorite artists of the last 15 years. When he's doing electric, the garage rock stuff, I think he's on it. He's got great ideas. He's innovative. He meshes throwback to the 60s, 70s rock with some new crazy ideas. I just don't know if it worked in this setting. And he was him and acoustic. He just didn't seem to be into it either. That was part of the problem. But yeah, I wasn't too impressed with that performance. But it was still cool to see him. And I don't know. I feel like if that many people came out to see you, you should really put on a show. And that was the interesting contrast between him and the Mountain Goats. Was Mountain Goats, even though I'm not into their music, put on a really good show. And I think that's sort of, it's different from, being a fan or not. It's more about, are you putting on a show? Are you giving people their money's worth? Or all these fans came out to see him, and he just kind of messed around on acoustic guitar. That's what it seemed like to me. And let's see. Finally, most recent show I saw, as I'm wearing this shirt here, I saw Obituary. Was the main reason I was going to this. It's Amon Amarth, played in Charlotte in November with Cattle Decapitation, which I'm not a huge fan of. That. That's a newer metal band. But the band, there was 4 bands. There was Obituary, Amon Amarth, Cattle Decapitation, and Carcass, the legendary British thrash band from back in the 80s. They were by far blew everybody off the stage. Carcass did. It was cool to see Obituary. Got this cool T-shirt, but I should have got a Carcass T-shirt. Let's put it that way. They were incredible, and the pit was insane for all 4 bands, especially by the time Amon Amarth came out. That's when I went down there and got in the pit. And so those are some shows that I've seen recently. Well, recently, it's over the past year, just kind of catching you up to date. The matter at hand, wanted to talk about, now these are my top 20 favorite debut albums. These are the ones that I either just like or I feel have a place in rock history as being really important albums as well. That's sort of the criteria for how I pick these. And I'll have some honorable mentions at the end as well, a couple. So I'll go ahead and start off with number 20. And it's this album right here, In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. Years ago, this would probably have been ranked a lot higher for me, but as time has gone by, I've gotten into some of their later work a lot more. I tend to not be so much of a fan of their first couple of albums, and I'm not as big of a fan of the trio of albums that were released in the early 80s, where they were kind of the red and the yellow and the blue album, or whatever they are. Discipline. That's sort of has been referred to as their Talking Heads period, where they're trying to kind of sound like New Wave and Talking Heads. I like those albums okay, but my real favorite right now is The Red. Some of the stuff in the mid-70s, like John Wetton came to the band. I think just anything John Wetton has done turns to gold. Great bass player, great vocalist. His work in Uriah Heep and Asia, just phenomenal. And he's been in a million bands. So, but that being said, it all started with this, and you really can't deny not just the influence and how groundbreaking it was, how different it was, but just the sheer magnitude of this album. Pete Townsend went into press in some interview at the time, 1969, calling this a schizophrenic masterpiece, was his quote, and that really got everyone's attention because it's like, who's this new band, King Crimson? And, this album is also very dark. It's very dark. It can be a little depressing when you listen to it. But, songs like I Talk to the Wind, one of the most beautiful songs ever made. And, this has got, of course, Greg Lake, who would later be in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, singing lead vocals on this. They changed lead singers over the years. John Anderson sang at one point from Yes. So the story goes that the audition for a lead singer, that they tried out a lot of singers that would end up being pretty famous later, like Elton John tried out for this band, as well as Brian Ferry, later of Roxy Music. And but anyway, that's my number 20. And again, these are in this order. These can change at any time. These are just my current, as of today, these are my top 20, least favorite to favorite. And like I said, a couple years ago, this would have ranked higher. But yeah, great artwork and lyrics by, I believe Pete Sinfield did the lighting and the lyrics. Someone else did the artwork. But yeah, great lineup. Very well recorded. Robert Fripp does a good job of bringing in the right instruments. He did a lot of the arranging, all the arranging. And, you've got oboes and flutes and things. It's just Mellotron, early use of the Mellotron. Very good debut album. This also, at number 19, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, would have ranked a lot higher. It's Piper at the Gates of Dawn, first album from Pink Floyd, and really the only full album with Syd Barrett kind of in control of the band before he had his mental breakdown in about 1968. He was on Saucerful of Secrets as well, but at that point, that's their second album, and at that point, Dave Gilmour and Roger Waters are kind of already taken over the band at this point. Roger Waters hadn't really completely taken over until closer to the Dark Side of the Moon, but this is really Syd Barrett when he was at healthy, creative. It was recorded 1967, released 1967. Same time, same studio as the Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles, and they, interestingly, as diverse and complex as this album sounds, they only had a 5,000-pound advance to record this, and they didn't have a lot of the perks that record companies would give bands later. It was pretty typical at the time to not get a lot of money to record an album, but one thing they did include in this, which was really unusual, the record company gave them a sizable space and money to experiment in the studio, which they certainly took advantage of, which, had they not done that, we probably wouldn't hear this album the way it is today. So, yeah, so very innovative, very influential, arguably one of the first prog rock bands and prog rock albums right here. Even though it got labeled as psychedelic, it was a lot more experimental than much of the acid rock and psychedelic music of that 1967 Summer of Love. All right, number 18. Let's pull it out here. I'm going to go with this. This is the debut album from Montrose. Montrose, this was 1973, one of the heaviest American hard rock bands to emerge post the British blues and early proto-metal movement, when bands like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Uriah Heep were all coming out of England. There weren't a lot of American bands that were super heavy. There was Cactus and these guys, as far as American, really, really heavy rock. Not quite metal, but definitely proto-metal and hard rock. Of course, legendary lead vocalist as Sammy Hagar, who would later be, go solo, and then in Van Halen, we all know the story there. And but yeah, this is definitely a strong debut album. But one of those bands that came out strong with this, and then after that, just kind of the second album just did not live up to the first. They lost their edge really quick, and it had something to do with the fact that Sammy Hagar wanted to go in one direction, Ronnie Montrose wanted to go another, and pretty much the rest is history. By the end of the '70s, they were done, and Sammy Hagar went solo, and as I say, the rest is history. All right, so my next one, what are we at? We're number 16 here. Debut album from the Stooges, Iggy and the Stooges, 1969 also, same as King Crimson. My favorite album by these guys is the second album, Funhouse, released in 1970, but this is probably my second favorite. This is just when the band was really together. They were new, they were fresh, and there wasn't a lot going on like this in 1969. In '69, you were either blues rock, heavy rock, still doing acid rock. But these guys were doing something completely different. They had an edge. There's not a lot I can say about this album that hasn't already been said. 1969 is a great song. I Want to Be Your Dog. And there's some weird moments on it too, like We Will Fall, which is probably one of the weaker tracks, honestly, just because it's like over 10 minutes long, and it's kind of like a rip-off of like a Doors kind of. It's sort of like they were trying to sound like the End by the Doors, and it just doesn't quite work. Yeah, Real Cool Time, No Fun, classic, been covered by every punk band. So definitely proto-punk here, and definitely a very strong debut album. All right, this is where the order can kind of fluctuate. It can change. I'm just basing this on kind of what I've been listening to lately and feeling lately. 1985, out of Scotland, Jesus and Mary Chain. We're doing a whole different kind of dark wave, if you want to call it that. Post-punk. It wasn't synth pop. It wasn't hardcore punk. They always get lumped in that category with Echo and the Bunnymen, New Order, Joy Division, Cure, all these bands. But they had their own thing going on. They were definitely a guitar-based band, primarily. They were really influenced by American music like Beach Boys and Love and The Doors. But then they also were influenced by a German band, Can, and a lot of the krautrock stuff. So an interesting mix. Key tracks on this would definitely be Taste of Cindy, let's see, The Hardest Walk, Just Like Honey, of course, was kind of the hit on this, and Never Understand is a great song. You Trip Me Up, those are like the top tracks right there. Hardest Walk, You Trip Me Up, and Taste of Cindy, probably my favorites. When I first bought this album years ago, it was released in '85, but I didn't get it until a couple years after, I guess, I don't know, probably like 5 or 10 years afterwards. I didn't like this album. I thought I didn't understand the production. It was just so tinny and high pitched, and it kind of reminded me of almost like Husker Du's early albums. But didn't take long after I listened to it a couple of times. I really understood the brilliance of this album, and it's really about the melodies and the Reed brothers and what they contributed to rock music at that time. This was sort of like the beginning of alternative music before it was called alternative. It was called modern rock at the time, or college rock. But this band, along with the Smiths, The Cure, Depeche Mode, Echo and the Bunnymen, Chameleons, Susie and the Banshees, Cocteau Twins, all these kind of bands, New Order. Those bands were really the beginning of what would become alternative and influencing those bands that we would hear later in the 90s. So this is a strong debut. Talking about debuts, you got to include this. 1983, arguably, a lot of metal purists are going to argue this is not the first thrash album, but Slayer released their album the same year. But at the end of '83, Metallica released this at the beginning of '83, and there were influences to thrash music before this. Obscure bands like Onslaught, Sodom, I think, had some records out. And of course, Venom, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden. Um, all of the new wave of British heavy metal really influenced thrash, as well as the influence of punk, hardcore punk. Bands like Minor Threat and Black Flag, Misfits. But this is just every track is killer. You still got some stuff on here that was written by Dave Mustaine before he was kicked out of the band. But you started off with "Hit the Lights," one of the greatest songs ever. "Motor Breath," "Jump in the Fire," "Whiplash," "Seek and Destroy." I mean, come on. It was recorded really strange. James Hetfield apparently had a head cold when this was recorded, so his voice breaks in a couple parts, and a lot of this material was written in '81, as early as '81, '82. So when the next album came out, "Ride the Lightning," was just a year after this. It sounded so drastically different because James' voice was healed and all the material was fresh and new. So it was a big leap between this album and the next one. But yeah. And the next one, let's see, what am I at here? Oh, I don't know what number I'm at. I guess I'm at 14, something like that. 1966, Love. It's Arthur Lee right here. And Brian McLean, who was he was actually a roadie for the Byrds, and actually started this band kind of following the Byrds around and influenced heavily. And you can hear that a lot on this album. A lot of Beatles influence, a lot of Byrds, but the songwriting is really strong from Arthur Lee. And unfortunately, we lost him back in 2006. I got to see Arthur Lee at the Warsaw Club in Brooklyn in 2003. Shortly before he became ill. And that was awesome just to see him do all these old love songs. And Patti Smith was in the audience, and Lenny Kaye was in the audience, and all of these people that were influenced by him. But this band was very influential on Led Zeppelin. A lot of the British heavy rock artists look back to this band. They're not quite metal here, but the second album, Da Capo, and the third album, Forever Changes, were hugely influential on punk as well as metal. They were just kind of they were a little weird even for California in 1966. They came out of the same scene as the Doors and the Byrds. It was a Los Angeles thing. This was the first rock band signed to Elektra Records, and it was actually Arthur Lee who suggested the executive of Elektra Records to come check out this band called The Doors, who were playing at the Whiskey A Go Go, and The Doors were signed on the spot when they were observed playing. But this is great. Definitely, this album here, just when I first got this, got me through some dark periods in my life. Probably the most famous track on here was the Little Red Book, which was their only top 40 hit, I think. Can't Explain, My Flash on You is one of their absolute greatest songs, and their cover of Hey Joe with Brian McLean singing lead vocals. Very strong debut. And there's the vinyl, which I was lucky enough to find, original pressing, for like a couple of dollars in a basement sale at a record store. Pretty amazing. Kind of along the same lines as the last couple, Stooges and Love. Got to include this here. A little bit surprising to some people that I would rank this so low, considering I've gone on record as saying this is one of, if not my favorite rock band of all time. Velvet Underground and Nico, debut album. This is the only one that Nico was on singing vocals. Half the songs she's singing lead on. This one's ranked low because I've just never been, when you compare this to like Loaded or their third album, self-titled album, Velvet Underground, it just does not compare. Now, this is a groundbreaking album produced by Tom Wilson, who also produced Bob Dylan at the time. Just completely groundbreaking, original. I mean, there's nothing I can say about the Velvet Underground that hasn't been said. but we're talking again 1967, stellar year for rock music. Andy Warhol album cover there, iconic. It's now firmly woven into the fabric of American culture and art and music all over the world. But at this time, very underground, and no pun intended, and very not a lot of people heard this. But this was, speaking of the Stooges, which I just talked about a minute ago. Iggy Pop had talked about hearing this record at a party, and it really inspired him on his method of singing and his approach to music. So, huge band as far as influence is concerned. Not a lot of sales, but now legendary status. Great debut album. And I'm kind of in the vein here. Similar time frame as Love and Stooges. Signed to Elektra Records. Same times MC5. Kick Out the Jams. There's the vinyl. And I love the vinyl. It's got this cool fold out of the band. Looking rather punk and revolutionary, as they were so apt to describe themselves. This was recorded live Halloween 1968 at the Grandy Ballroom in Detroit, Michigan. MC5 were the house band, so they would open for everybody from Iron Butterfly to Janis Joplin, Santana. They were the band that opened, and this album just had a huge impact on my life when I bought this as a teenager back in the 90s. I just stumbled across this in a CD store and I'd always read about it, thought the album cover looked interesting. Didn't really know much about them other than they were influential, and never got played on the radio. So I picked it up, I put it on, and this, like a couple of albums in my life, that just blew me away immediately, and I just couldn't stop listening to it. I listened to it over and over and over. But Ramblin' Rose, very weird opening song. Kick Out the Jams, the title track, of course. Come Together, Rocket Reducer. I Want You Right Now. Just imagine the Who at that time just taken up a notch. I mean, they were that heavy. And that's the thing that this band doesn't get a lot of credit for, because their second and third album were good. They were okay. They were very produced in the studio. Just did not have the energy that they were meant to be a live band. And this album is it's really heavy for a proto-punk album. Heavier than the Stooges and some of the others. But yeah, MC5, Kick Out the Jams, 1969. Let's see, what am I down to here? Down to 11, number 11. Debut album from R.E.M. This is officially their first album. They did have Chronic Town out in 82. But it was only like 5 or 6 songs. This is their first full-length album, 1983, on IRS Records. But yeah, this band has had tremendous impact on my life. I got into this band a little late, even though I grew up in Georgia and always heard about R.E.M. I came in on the Green album. Green is still my favorite album by them. That was in 1988. I was around the age of 12. So then I went back and got this on vinyl, which I have framed on the wall over there, and then got it on CD as well. It was a very unusual album, iconic cover. It was rated by a lot of music magazines in 83 as one of the best albums, if not the best. Even outranking Michael Jackson's Thriller, which was quite an accomplishment for a unknown band. But yeah, Critics' Darlings for a while, and then by 87, 88, they had their breakthrough with The One I Love and the Green album. But yeah, just great songs like reworking of Radio Free Europe, Pilgrimage, Laughing, Catapult, Sitting Still, 9 to 9 is one of my favorite songs. But another one of my favorite bands, certainly their 80s and early 90s output. They seem to change quite a bit with each album. And, at this time, they're this kind of jangly guitar, Rickenbacker sound going on with some weird sound effects all over the place and the spooky kudzu album cover. But great debut. And let's see, number 10, another bizarre album cover. Bizarre album. Released in another stellar year for music, 1972. It's the first album from Roxy Music. One of only two of their albums to feature Brian Eno in the band. Just a strange album and still holds up today, some 50 years later. Just very bizarre arrangements. Phil Manzanera on guitar, Brian Ferry on keyboards and lead vocals, and Brian Eno on the synth and experimental electronic sounds. And they had a clarinet or an oboe player. Just a very bizarre band. They can't ever quite label these guys. Were they glam rock? Were they prog? Were they was it early new wave? They were kind of all those things, honestly. They're very influential on the synth pop movement in later in the 80s, right? So 1972, yeah. And then the next album would be For Your Pleasure, and that would be the last one with Brian Eno would leave after that. And honestly, in my opinion, the albums after that just didn't quite match up to these first two albums, and I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. Avalon is a good last album that they did, and second to last album in 1982 was a pretty good album, but nothing they ever did compares to this. This is definitely a very, very strong debut album, very unusual. And let's see, so what are we at here? 9, number 9, 1990, Black Crowes, Shake Your Moneymaker, an almost perfect album. Come on, this is another one of my Georgia bands. Some of my fellow Georgians here came out of the gate strong with this one. Young guys, no one had ever heard of them. They come out, and within the first year this is released, they're opening for Robert Plant and Aerosmith. Pretty phenomenal. Saw them when I was 15 years old on the infamous ZZ Top performance in '91. They brought Lenny Kravitz on stage, and they did a version of Get Back by the Beatles, which was amazing. This is back when Lenny had the long dreadlocks. But yeah, you've got this. They're on Deaf American at this point. Rick Rubin is involved, but you've got Twice as Hard, Jealous Again, Sister Luck, Could Have Been So Blind, Seeing Things, Hard to Handle. Hard to Handle is one of the weaker tracks in my opinion. I don't ever need to hear that song again. I don't even like the Otis Redding version, to be honest with you. And then I would say Struttin' Blues is also a little bit of a throwaway, but everything else, perfect. And I don't know if it says it in the liner notes, I believe this is the only album with Jeff Cease on guitar. He would have been replaced. He would have been out of the band by the second album, Southern Harmony Musical Companion. But yeah, classic album, Shake Your Moneymaker, 1990. One of the classic albums of all time, for sure. And let's see, what are we at here? Number 8. Gotta have this in here when you're talking about debut albums. What can I say? It's the first real punk album. I don't care what the Brits say. Blitzkrieg Bop, Beat on the Brat, Chainsaw, Loudmouth, my all-time favorite Ramones song on this. 53rd and 3rd, Let's Dance, Listen to My Heart. Almost every track on here is just incredible. The only ones I kind of skip over are Judy is a Punk and Chainsaw. Now I want to sniff some glue. I don't want to go down to the basement. I Want to Be Your Boyfriend. Classic album. I mean, this is like really like a Beach Boys album, or it's like it reminds you of that. Like the melodies are just so strong. It just happens to be a punk album in this iconic album cover right here. I mean, come on. We're lucky enough to see these guys in their very last tour, 95, 96. Driving and Crying opened. And I believe, yeah, that was at Masquerade Music Park in Atlanta. And I got to be on the third row to see these guys. So that's probably my all-time concert highlight that I got to see them, along with seeing the original Black Sabbath reunite in '98. Let's see, what are we? I told you I'd switch these around. 1, 2. Coming in at number 7. I'm gonna do this. The Cars. My copy's a little beat up. Cars debut album, 1978. It's one of the few albums that every song is a hit, right? I mean, Good Times Roll, Best Friend's Girl, Just What I Needed, Don't You Stop, You're All I've Got Tonight, Bye Bye Love, Moving in Stereo. I think the only 2 songs that are not hits are All Mixed Up and I'm in Touch with Your World. And let's see, the thing that's interesting about this album is, their later albums, people often say, are very, poppy, and this first album is really heavy. It's almost like a hard rock album, even though they were kind of lumped in this like new wave thing, and they were a new wave band. But the Cars' first album was definitely, it was produced by Roy Thomas Baker. And I think that has something to do with it, because, Roy Thomas Baker had produced metal bands. He had worked with, up to that point, had worked with some pretty heavy stuff. And I think that has something to do with the sound. He's worked with Free and Nazareth and Queen up to this point. So he's working with some kind of heavier kind of acts, and so it makes sense that they, by the second album, which was just a year later, Candio, they really were a lot more watered down and a lot poppier than they were on this. And so anyway, Cars' debut album, 1978. Can't talk about debut albums without this. This is an album that we all know. We've heard every song on it. And this Jimi Hendrix Experience, Are You Experience? Again, 1967. Almost every song is a hit. I've heard them a million times. I almost didn't include this because it's just so known. Everybody knows it. Purple Haze, Manic Depression, Hey Joe, May This Be Love, Wind Cries Mary, Fire, Foxy Lady, classic. Basically gave birth to the electric guitar as we know it, right? There would be no metal, no hard rock without this. And that rhythm section too. Mitch Mitchell, Noel Redding. Come on. Let's see. Number 5. I'm going to go with Appetite for Destruction, Guns N' Roses. I have the original album cover that was banned. Once they were sold out of this pressing, they did the iconic skulls on the cross that we all know. There's a great shot of the band back there. So another almost perfect debut album. You got It's So Easy, Welcome to the Jungle, Night Train, Mr. Brownstone, Paradise City, My Michelle, Sweet Child of Mine, Think About You. Sold a bazillion copies, biggest selling debut album since Boston's first album, 1976. So, that held his top spot for, 11, 12 years. Unfortunately, they did release the magnificent, in my opinion, GNR Lies after this. The record company did, to kind of milk it, get what they could out of this band. But to me, they were done by the time the 90s rolled around as far as being a band. There's some moments on Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 that are great, but doesn't compare to this Appetite for Destruction. 1987. Let's see, coming in at number 4, another almost perfect debut album, perfect album period, Van Halen, 1978. Perfect. I mean, no one had played guitar like this before. No, another heavy American band that, they just reinvented the wheel, really. But you got Ain't Talking About Love, one of my 2 favorite Van Halen songs ever. There's a great picture of David Lee Roth doing the back bend on the back. Eruption, Ice Cream Man, Running with the Devil, Atomic Punk. Come on. Yeah, perfect. And that's the guitar, famous guitar Eddie donated to Dimebag Darrell of Pantera when he was killed. And that guitar is actually buried in the casket with Dimebag Darrell. Dimebag always wanted that guitar. Yeah, we lost Eddie a couple years ago. Was it like a year ago now? All right, now is where it gets a little tricky, and I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. I had 21, and so for my third one, and I didn't pull the prop out. It's back here in my records somewhere, and I didn't pull it out. Is the debut album from Cactus, which was Tim Bogert on bass, formerly of Vanilla Fudge, and Carmine Appice on drums. I mean, come on. If you haven't heard Cactus, you've got to listen to this album, debut album. Their second album was amazing too, but that's a kind of a tie for my number 3. My other number 3 is, of course, and this was really hard. I mean, this could have easily been number 2, number 1. Black Sabbath, 1970. The birth of heavy metal, right here. I mean, come on. Wicked World, Wizard, NIB, Wasp, the song Black Sabbath. After Volume 4, I'd say Volume 4 is my favorite. This would probably still be second. Although I have grown to love some of the later Ronnie James Dio albums, like Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. And I even love the Ian Gillan one, Born Again, 83, and Dehumanizer when Dio came back. But when you're talking 70s original Black Sabbath, I mean, this is the one that started it all. That spooky album cover. One of easily my top 5 favorite bands, and for good reason. Influential on all of hard rock, metal, obviously, but also alternative music as well. It just kind of influenced everything that came after. And whereas Led Zeppelin might have been more successful and more technically talented musicians, Sabbath were the ones who invented the genre as far as the imagery and the sound, and really made it heavy. Way beyond what Led Zeppelin did. And coming in at number 2, another almost perfect album, also released on that wonderful Elektra Records along with Stooges, MC5, and Love. Doors' first album, 1967, was a great year. The only weak track on here for me, and I have no idea why it's on here, I hate the Alabama song, Whiskey Bar. But other than that, and that's a cover too. That's a Kurt Weill song. But everything else, Crystal Ship is my all-time favorite Doors song. Break On Through, Soul Kitchen, 20th Century Fox, Light My Fire, Backdoor Man, I Looked at You, Into the Night, great song. Take It As It Comes, and of course The End. Every song on here is great except for that Alabama song. Just my opinion. One of the pillars of rock music, and especially classic rock, American classic rock. This might come as a surprise, but my number 1 pick for debut albums, best debut albums of all time, is this band right here. It was released in 1976. I can't think of another album, period, debut or not, by any band that's as perfect as this. 8 songs, 3 on the first side, 5 on the second, and every song is pretty much a radio hit. Just like similar to the Cars. And they are also coming from the same same city, which is Boston. Uh, to me, still what I consider the most perfectly recorded album. We all know the story by now. Tom Schultz, genius, former employee at Kodak, engineer, recorded most of the guitar tracks in his basement. Um, but more than a feeling, peace of mind, long time, rock and roll band, smoking, Hitch a Ride, my all-time favorite rock song probably is Hitch a Ride. Something About You, and Let Me Take You Home Tonight. All those songs are on the radio. If they weren't top 40 hits, they're radio hits. But there you go. That's my top 20 debut albums. And some honorable mentions I just wanted to throw out here. 1995, after the death of Kurt Cobain and the end of Nirvana, and pretty much the coming to the end of grunge, Dave Grohl puts out this album, Foo Fighters. This is another band like Montrose and a few others. Another one that I'll mention, two others that I'll mention here in a minute, that came out of the gate just guns blazing. This is such a good album. So punk and so heavy and so loud. And I saw these guys twice touring for this. They were just amazing. This is when he was touring with the guys from Sunny D Real Estate. And then with the second album, they just lost me. I am not a Foo Fighters fan after this, but this album right here, a lot of memories with this album. That was a long, hot summer, 1995, and there was just this another one of those albums that's just, this is a call. I'll stick around. Alone and Easy Target. Those are probably the top tracks. Big Me was the kind of hit off this, the softer one, but just a sonic album, really amazing. And I don't know what happened after this, but sorry, I just could not get into this band after this album right here. But that's an honorable mention. This is kind of cheating a little bit. Sex Pistols, technically the only album they ever released, so it was their first and their last album. I mean, so just a really well-recorded album. Glenn Matlock, mostly on bass at the time. Sid Vicious only appears, I think, on one or two tracks. 1977. The Ramones were the first punk album to be released because it was released in 76. But this is the one everyone thinks of, and this is what kind of established the image and the attitude of punk. But this is a really well-recorded album, and actually the playing on it is actually really good for a band that prided themselves on being kind of, trashy and sloppy. But this is really well produced, really well recorded. I'd say my favorite tracks on this are Pretty Vacant, 17, and Submission. Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks. Let's see. What do we got here? 1992, Blind Melon, debut album. Another band from the 90s that really started out strong. This is a really strong debut album. And then second album, Soup. I just never got into that album. But this has Tones of Home, Drive, Sleepy House, probably my three favorite. And then Change, Love Change. Just a great album, classic album. Never have to hear No Rain again for the rest of my life, but the rest of it, awesome. Also from the 90s, and similar to the Foo Fighters and the Blind Melon situation, Pearl Jam, 10, 1991, one of those classics of that grunge era. Second album was good, Versus, but they lost me after that with Vitology. I just never was a fan of that album. This has got some of their best songs, so all my favorite songs, Garden, Black, Even Flow, Alive. When you hear the riff come on for Alive, I mean, come on. It's a moment in time with this. And David Bruzzese was a great drummer, and I hate that they kicked him out of the band, but Porch, great song. Let's see, 1983, Fastway, supergroup of sorts. You got Jerry Shirley on drums, who had played with Humble Pie. He also played on Sid Barrett's solo albums. Fast Eddie Clarke, who had been in Motorhead, and David King on vocals. And I believe is it Fast Eddie Clarke. One of these guys went on to be in Flogging Molly later, which is strange. But this is it's real. It's like AC/DC meets Bad Company meets punk. It's kind of a fast-paced hard rock album. Um, kind of underappreciated. It's a really good debut. And last but not least, the debut album from Heart, 1975, the year I was born. Magic Man, Crazy on You, Barracuda, come on. And then the title track, it's just amazing. Amazing. Sing Child, great song. Kind of like Zeppelin-esque hard rock with flutes. But yeah, another great honorable mention. Well, that concludes my list. So that's my top 20 or 21 favorite debut albums of all time. Please put your comments down in the comments section and like my video. And next video that I got coming up, I'm going to be doing ranking the albums by The Police. So looking forward to doing that. Until then, this is Smoke Signals, and we'll see you next time.